Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. My name's Huw Fullerton.
My name's Morgan Jeffrey.
And this week we're talking all about the weird and wonderful twisting world of Doctor Who canon. That's not canon. Yes, it is. How does that conflict with the continuity? Oh, I'm so angry now. Oh, that's what canon's like. And yeah, basically canon is, what is the history of something? What is the established fact of a TV show or book or whatever? And Morgan, when it comes to Doctor Who, what would you say Doctor Who canon is?
Ever changing. The issue with Doctor Who canon, as opposed to the established mythology of any other TV show or film, even in the science fiction genre, is that Doctor Who has just been running now for so long. Over 5 decades, right? Well over. And it's been subject to the whims of different creative teams over that time. And so there have been so many new facts and figures added to the lore over the years in order for the story to keep evolving and moving forward. But frequently, there is no pun intended, there is no continuity between these. And so you will inevitably have these clashes where a new plot point is established, but it conflicts with something from 30 years before. Talking about things like the Doctor having 2 hearts, for example, right?
Yeah, because that's something, if I'm right, like early in the series, it's sort of at least implied that William Hartnell's Doctor only has 1 heart, isn't it?
Yeah, a companion, I think, takes his takes his pulse, and certainly doesn't comment on the fact that there are 2 of them, which fans have taken to imply that the Doctor at that point only has 1 heart. Later on in its first John Pertwee, the first 3rd Doctor story, Spear from Space, it's established that the Doctor has 2 hearts. Now, clearly, the production team at the time just didn't think back to that earlier reference. But fans, we like things to knit together neatly. And that doesn't quite fit. That's a new established fact that doesn't fit with an old one. And if fans in their headcanon have tried to come up with a way that might work, there's this idea that maybe Time Lords only grow their 2nd heart when they regenerate for the first time. And that's why the first Doctor only had 1 heart. But now we know he wasn't the first Doctor, and that wasn't the first time the Doctor regenerated, so that doesn't work. So that's a perfect example of a later established fact that totally contradicts a previous established fact.
Definitely. And I think, like you say, the part of the reason that we've brought this up now is recently we had The Timeless Children, the series 12 finale, with Jodie Whittaker's Doctor revealed that there's way more Doctors than we thought. We revealed a lot of stuff about the Doctor, that she's not from Gallifrey and all that. But I think the thing that really kind of got people was the fact that William Hartnell's not the first Doctor in a way. Like, he's still the first Doctor, but he's not the original, and only original Doctor. And the thing is, it's quite interesting because if when the series was starting, you talked to somebody watching it or making the show, they wouldn't have known that there would be other Doctors, so they'd be really confused by what we were talking about. But also, I don't think it would have been as offensive an idea that the Doctor had a past, because that was the point, right? In William Hartnell's time, was that the Doctor had this past that you gradually find out about, and you only start to find out about things like Time Lords and stuff when it's Patrick Troughton and beyond. So the thing with this is, I think, it's things like the brain of Morbius are examples where that is something that is technically as canon as the regeneration limit. It's just we sort of decided that it wasn't. Do you know what I mean? So in Brain of Morbius, which is an episode with Tom Baker, we see the Doctor has previous incarnations before William Hartnell, and then just a few years later they basically say, "Oh no, that's just." Oh no, that wouldn't be possible. Well, I mean, technically, I think at the time it would have been, but since then we've sort of decided, oh yeah, those are actually just weird reflections from Morbius and is like visions, and it's fine. And now we know, oh no, they are real again. So it's always a bit messy. And one thing that contradicts canon today is actually confirming an earlier bit of canon that was later contradicted by a different bit of canon again. Right? Like it's all a twisting, turning thing.
And it's all. I think the way Doctor Who is made is unlike any other show in the sense, like I say, it has been going on for so long. It has had so many different production teams, creative teams working on it. It's a bit like one of those, stories where someone writes a sentence, they fold up the bit of paper, someone else writes the next sentence, and so on, and then you unfold it at the end, and what you're left with is total gibberish.
No offense to Doctor
Who. No, but I love Doctor Who, of course I do. But if you try and look at it as one cohesive story, it doesn't make a bit of sense because it was never designed to work in that way. It's not intended to be seen as a whole. It's intended to be enjoyed over the space of 50 years. So that's why those things don't always match up. And also, I think in terms of what we now do consider established lore and sort of the untouchable aspects of canon, and what we don't like to talk about, or the things we consider less important, I think that's very much based on individual fan opinion, right? And it has that there are other factors that play into that too, as to, whether or not you liked that particular development.
Well, I think to be honest, I think that's the main thing that we decide whether something's canon or not, is if we kind of think it's a cool idea. Like, for example, I was talking to Stephen Moffat recently for an interview, and he said that in his opinion, Patrick Troughton, when he, appears in, what's the Power of the
Daleks?
Yeah. He doesn't act like he's the first Doctor to be regenerated. Like, he doesn't specifically say, "Oh, look, it's my fifth go." But he doesn't seem overly surprised. He doesn't seem unfamiliar with the process. Like, that's a bit nebulous. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's hard to sort of say definitively. But there's stuff like that. And obviously, Brain of Morbius, which is now canon, implied earlier Doctors, and that was retconned. People said that making William Hartnell not the first Doctor in The Time as Children was an insult, but it was done first in the 1970s. Was it an insult to that story when it was established that that couldn't be possible? The Doctor's half human. That's the one that comes up a lot in the TV movie. It's not a joke. It's it's a story point. The Master's plan in that film wouldn't work if the Doctor was anything but half human, and it sort of has been touched on in the series a little bit in the sort of hybrid Peter Capaldi arc, but not really. It's never really important to the story. I don't think the Doctor doesn't really change anything. I mean, the Doctor's also now not only not half human, but also not Gallifreyan. Now I think about it.
Right.
So
how does that whole half?
How does that? Oh my god!
Oh, I didn't even think about that. How does the whole half human thing chime with the Timeless Child reveals? It doesn't at all.
No one's mentioned that, have they? No one's been having about that. It's because people don't like the half human reveal. And I think we can be a little facetious, but I think it is one of those things where if something works and you like it, you kind of just let it go past. You're like, yeah, whatever, we'll work it in. Like, there's lots of stuff that contradicts other stuff. And I think it's now we're much more aware of it, partly because we have like these online databases of everything that's happened in Doctor Who, this data core, things like that. And also because with so many people watching it so closely, and there's so much of it, that there's little things where the thing with Jo Martin's new Doctor, her TARDIS is a police box. That couldn't be possible because of his timing. And I'm sort of like, there's definitely stuff that makes less sense than that in 1960s, 1970s Doctor Who. But because it wasn't under the same microscope, I think you got away with it.
I think you're 100% right. I think the show, was originally intended to be, episodes of the show produced in the 60s, 70s, 80s were intended to be watched once. And now that's not the case. They're they're watched over and over and over again. Even those older episodes are watched over and over and over again, and they're sort of examined and dissected by fans, and we write up these incredible TARDIS wiki pages where we try and make everything fit together, and it just doesn't, because again, that's not how this show was designed. There wasn't that level of thought that went into it, that it was all this great mosaic that was supposed to fit together. Writers and producers at the time, they just did what they thought was a good story. And I think that's the way still to go about it, right? Is to, if you want to, I'll probably be hunted down for saying this, but if you want to throw certain aspects of canon out of the window in order to tell a good story, and I think you do need to tell a good story in order to make it worthwhile, then I think that's totally fine.
Definitely. And, just because something's been established once in a specific way doesn't mean you can't ever challenge that or play around with it, especially a series that delves into time travel. I mean, so many things that we consider like immutable facts of Doctor Who, are things that weren't real in the first series. Like, retrospectively, we say, oh yeah, that happened. Like, who's to say the first Doctor was the first Doctor? We kind of just... The show has since said that, but at the time that wasn't the intention. Susan apparently named the TARDIS. We know that probably wasn't true. You can write that in your head wherever you want, but
I do like the idea that possibly Susan just sort of went TARDIS. Oh, TARDIS! I've named it TARDIS, and the Doctor didn't want to tell her that the Time Lords had already done that, and there was sort of like You totally did that, Susan. You did that.
Yes. Nice work on the acronym there.
Yeah, God, yeah. No one's ever thought of that before, Susan. Brilliant.
This is why I take you around on my travels.
Yeah. No, exactly. This. I think a lot of it's so odd as well what we consider, as I say, the fixed canon and the stuff like the half-human reveal that is, as valid a reveal as any other, but that we just turn a blind eye to. And I think so much of it is down to how well we feel those reveals were executed. So everyone thinks the War Games is pretty good, right? So we're fine with the Doctor being being a Time Lord from that planet, the planet Gallifrey. But the TV movie, and I quite like the TV movie, but the half-human reveal is not its strongest point. It's kind of like a bungled reveal. It's not played with any, if that was the intention, to make this huge reveal about the Doctor's origins, it's kind of thrown away in that moment. So I think we just sort of ignore it because it wasn't executed particularly well, and we don't want to look back on that reveal, right? Whereas the moments that are executed particularly well, or that form part of a story that's quite well respected, so like the regeneration limit is part of the Deadly Assassin, which now is held up as an all-time classic, so we're fine with it. But actually, that's another point, that at the time that story was quite controversial because of the way fans thought its portrayal of Time Lord society contradicted the War Games. So it's Doctor Who isn't about kind of like hard mythology and immutable canon. It's this sort of constantly living, breathing, constantly evolving thing.
I think as well, there's things that would feel wrong, like if the Doctor suddenly picks up a machine gun and starts like gunning down people, there's something you're like, well, that doesn't seem right. You know what I mean? Like, that's like a character mistake. Like there are things that you want to keep consistent about characters and about how they behave, but not always. With bad guys and stuff, you can play around a bit more with that. But it's something like, what's the sort of particular backstory of the Doctor's alien species who aren't in it all the time? Like, you feel like there is a little bit more wiggle room there to kind of play around with. And also, like you say, I think there's a point at which we kind of just have to think, is this something that, are we using canon as an excuse for criticizing something when maybe we just didn't like it, or maybe it wasn't executed very well? Like, maybe we don't need to say, oh, this person's taken a blowtorch to, Doctor Who history. It's kind of like, well, no, like maybe it was just a story I didn't like, or maybe it was a bad story. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's like this terrible insult and against the rules, like someone's broken the rules. Which, who wrote those? Who decided what was what? I mean,
and what's great about the show, not ever obeying its own rules, or even having rules really, and being this ever-changing thing, is that if you don't like a particular development, you probably don't need to worry about it that much, because it might be ignored going forward, or it might be rewritten again totally in 5 years. Fans didn't particularly respond well to the half-human reveal, so we just sort of ignored it. If you don't like the reveals of the Timeless Children, that's fine. Like, in the grand scheme of things, it probably won't impact the show really in terms of like the ethos of the show.
No.
And could well be altered or tweaked in a few years anyway. And because I think you're right in that what's important with Doctor Who is not the facts and figures. It's not like the Doctor has two hearts, but who cares really? That's not what's important about the show. What's important is the ethos and this idea of the compassionate traveler in time and space who goes around fixing things and helping people and defeating monsters. That's what's important, and everything else is sort of detail.
It's detail and kind of just extra background. Like, I mean, I said this to you before we started the call, but it kind of is like the opposite of something like Game of Thrones, the books and the TV shows, where that's a world that was created. It's a world that's built, world building, and then you're making a story in it. Like, to an extent, something like Game of Thrones is a story about the world that it's set in. Doctor Who is definitely a story about a particular character, and the world that's around that character has kind of developed as the story has gone on in a different way. And like you said, with different creative teams, a kind of tag team where people pass things forward. There's nobody involved in Doctor Who was directly involved 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Like, it's constantly changing. It would be mad if it did all fit together, considering how many episodes there are and how many different people, how many competing interests there have been with getting it made. That said, I do think that you sometimes also just have to kind of think, just give it a break. If maybe if something doesn't quite fit, it's okay also, and you can kind of fill in the gaps. Like, people love to kind of fill in the gaps, right? That's part of the fun of being a Doctor Who, I think.
That is part of the fun. Like having said all the stuff about, it constantly changes and canon shouldn't be fixed. I think part of the appeal of Doctor Who is the fact that it has been running so long and it has this enormous mythology that, as a fan, you can delve into and try and make sense of. And you can, the fact that it doesn't fit together perfectly is part of the appeal. It's not a negative at all, and because you can then make your own logical leaps as to how it all fits together.
Yeah, like, how did Missy turn into Sasha Dewan's master? Like, that's something that fans can sort of think, oh, that would be a fun story. I wonder what that is. And, maybe it will get filled in sometime. But sometimes there's stuff that we, might have thought was one thing, wasn't another. So, for example, don't know if I'm giving away a bit of behind the scenes detail here, but when I went on Jodie Whittaker's TARDIS for the first time with Arwell Wynne-Jones, who gave me a tour, he told me the little spinning plastic TARDIS, he had intended it to be the chameleon circuit, right? Like a visual representation of the chameleon circuit. That's what he thought as the designer. And when I spoke to the production team, they were like, well, it's not officially that. That's, kind of an idea Arwell had, but we don't want to commit to it being that, because then it can be anything. So it's kind of interesting there. It's like, is it canon that that's the chameleon circuit? Because what the designer thought is never mentioned on screen. In another episode, they might say, oh no, that's the Groggle chunk matrix. Like that.
And from then on, it's the Groggle chunk matrix.
Yeah, totally. And there's something quite fun about that, I think. Like, everything's sort of possible. Even if we think something is a certain way, another episode can come along and just sort of flip it completely differently. I think that's kind of the beauty of it, right? And I kind of enjoy that. That said, I do understand people getting frustrated when they feel like if a story is trying to, trade off against the weight of Doctor Who history and trying to sort of assume more importance because of that, and then also kind of, you can't really have it both ways, right? Like, you can't kind of say this is important because of the history and then also say, but we can do whatever we want to the history. Like, I think it kind of varies. I think you kind of have to walk a fine line. Like, either, it matters hugely and is all very important and serious, or you can play around with it. Do you know what I mean? Like, you kind of got to find a middle ground.
I think, I think it's, you have to accept that as much as it is about, ultimately, it should be about telling a good story. You have to accept, as I said earlier, that the canon is important to people, and so there is no sense in throwing it out the window unless you're going to tell a really good story. And some people enjoyed Time's Children, some people didn't. So opinions will vary as to whether or not that was a good change, based almost entirely on the fact of whether or not they think it was a good story to tell. But I personally think, so long as you're doing something interesting, it's fine to tweak the canon, and it doesn't erase what came before, right? It's still there, exists.
And I think as well, like you sort of alluded to earlier, there's a point at which we have to say, we'll only know whether this was a good thing in 20 years.
Yeah, all right.
Everyone will have decided, just like Deadly Assassin or whatever. Oh yeah, great stuff. How dare you contradict the canon of the Timeless Children, that really established what the Doctor's backstory was finally for good. And introduced us to the Morbius Doctors, and who could forget that incredible run of episodes in 2025 when we meet all the Morbius Doctors in turn. Paul McGann's back.
Yeah, I think the only thing that changes as much as Doctor Who is fan opinion. Fan opinion is also a very much an evolving thing. So, and let's not forget, those. We shouldn't underplay it. The changes that were made in the Timeless Children are big changes, right? They are big changes to establish canon, and they're also still quite fresh. So they kind of feel, we're still kind of getting to grips with exactly what those changes mean. If those changes are allowed to sit for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, imagine what it must have been like watching the War Games, not knowing anything about the Doctor's past. Presumably fans at the time had their own ideas about who the Doctor was and where he came from, and then you get this explanation, and people at the time might have said, well, that's not what I thought, and I think that's Time Lords, what lame, like
how naff.
Yeah, right, exactly. But we've had time to sit with it, and it's now become the reason it's so well respected as a plot development is just because of time, right? No pun intended. But with history comes this sort of weight to that reveal. And at the moment, Timeless Children doesn't have that, because it's a fresh new change, and we're still kind of getting to grips with it, and we have no idea exactly how it will impact the future of the show, and that can be a little bit scary. But I think if the aftermath is played right and it's explored in an interesting way, it could end up, eventually being held in the same lofty heights as the Time Lord reveal in the War Games.
Yeah, and more recently, something like the Time War, which starts out as a kind of an explanation for why we have the Time Lords, thundering around all the time. There's a bit new backstory for the Doctor. That becomes the thing that kind of defines, the first few series of New Who, right? Like that's a relatively recent canon change. If people had hated the Time War, I could imagine it wouldn't have factored in quite so much. It wouldn't have played such a big part in the 50th anniversary and beyond. But people are still talking about it, and it's still people writing stories in it for Big Finish. What's the word I'm looking for? The mandatory Big Finish mention in this week's podcast.
Big Finish will also do a stellar job of joining the gaps of Doctor Who facts that don't make sense. You're exactly right in that. It's only taken like 10, 15 years sort of thing for the Time War to become sort of a very, very well respected piece of Doctor Who lore. That if someone were to, I remember even at the time, Day of the Doctor sort of rewrote the end of the Time War, and fans were appalled because within that sort of space of like 8 years, it felt like it was a piece of canon that was very much part of the mythology. It had become an intractable part of the mythology that couldn't be changed. And given time, I feel like these Timeless Child reveals could take on that same weight, but it's just too early to judge how they'll sit in Doctor Who history at this point.
So really what you're saying is, when it comes to Doctor Who canon, it's a matter of constant regeneration and time.
Yes, in a roundabout way, that's exactly what I'm saying. There we go. Perfect.
Well, listen, that's us been yammering on about Doctor Who canon and lore and whatever you want to call it. And if you have a different opinion to us, you can let us know in the comments below, or on radiotimes.com. This sort of stuff does sometimes inspire some heated debate, Doctor Who canon, so keep it friendly. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. Please do check out our Doctor Who content on radiotimes.com as well, and we've got some fun interactive stuff going on as we're all stuck at home. And yeah, we will see you next week at the same time. But until then, I've been Huw Fullerton.
I've been Morgan Jeffrey.
And goodbye.